September 19th, 1944. The hills above Futa Pass, Italy. Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his face against the cold stone of the observation post and watched the American infantry company moving up the valley below. Through his field glasses, he counted maybe 80 men, spread out in good tactical formation, moving cautiously through the olive groves. His hands moved automatically to the fire control panel of his 8-centimeter Granatwerfer 34. The mortar sat in its prepared position behind the stone wall, its tube angled at 60 degrees, the baseplate firm in the rocky soil. Next to him, Obergefreiter Ernst Vogel was already stacking rounds, arranging them in precise rows the way they'd been trained at Wünsdorf. Klaus had crewed this mortar for 18 months. He knew its specifications like he knew his own heartbeat. Caliber, 81.4 millimeters. Weight, 62 kilograms broken into 3 loads. Maximum range with full charges, 2,400 meters. Rate of fire by a trained crew, 15 rounds per minute. Perhaps as many as 25 if you pushed it, if the barrel didn't overheat, if the ammunition bearers could keep up. It was, by every measure, an excellent weapon. Rheinmetall had built it in 1934, based on the French Brandt design, and German crews had made it legendary. At Monte Cassino, mortar teams had held off entire battalions. In the Rapido Valley, they'd turned river crossings into slaughterhouses. Klaus had fired over 3,000 rounds in combat. He'd seen what this weapon could do. The Americans were 600 meters away now, still moving, still exposed. Klaus adjusted the elevation handwheel with practiced precision, his eye finding the crosshairs through the panoramic sight. He could drop rounds into a 15-meter circle at this distance. He'd done it 100 times in training, 50 times in combat. Lieutenant Werner's voice crackled over the field. Telephone. All positions. Weapons tight. Wait for the signal. Make every round count. We don't have ammunition to waste. Klaus's stomach tightened. That phrase had become more common in recent weeks. Don't waste ammunition. Every round matters. The supply convoys from the north were running less frequently. The dumps were running low, but it didn't matter right now. Not with 80 American soldiers moving into his kill zone. Ernst handed him the first round, a 3.5 kilogram high-explosive shell with a percussion fuse. Klaus checked it automatically, the way he'd been trained. Propellant charges correct. Fins undamaged. Fuse armed. He dropped it into the tube and stepped back, covering his ears. The round hung for a split second on the firing pin, then launched with a hollow thump that Klaus felt in his chest. Through the binoculars, he watched the shell arc through the clear morning sky and impact 30 meters ahead of the American column. White smoke blossomed. The Americans scattered, diving for cover behind trees and stone walls. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Klaus loaded the second round without waiting for orders. Adjust left 20 meters, down 50. The math came automatically after 18 months. He fired. The shell impacted right on target. The Americans weren't moving forward anymore. They were pinned. Klaus fired again, then again. Ernst fed him shells methodically, his hands steady despite the noise. Round 7, round 8, round 9. And then Klaus saw something that made his breath catch. Through the smoke and dust, he spotted movement on the opposite ridge. Americans setting up equipment. 2 teams, maybe 3. He raised his field glasses and felt ice water run through his veins. Mortars, American 60mm mortars. He'd seen them before, captured one at Anzio. The Emdwer, lighter than his Granatwerfer, only 19 kilograms total, smaller caliber, shorter range. 1,800 meters maximum versus his 2,400. But there were 3 of them. And they were setting up fast, faster than seemed possible. No deliberate position preparation, no careful aiming. Just drop the baseplate, extend the bipod, load, fire. Klaus watched the first American crew through his binoculars and counted. 5 seconds from setup to first round. The shell launched with a different sound than his Granatwerfer, higher pitched, faster. It impacted 200 meters short of his position. Then the second American mortar fired. Then the third. Klaus fired again, his 11th round. But his attention was divided now, watching those American crews, counting their rhythm. The first American team fired their second round. Klaus counted the interval, 3.3 seconds. He must have miscounted. That couldn't be right. The second American team fired again. 3 seconds exactly between rounds. The third team matched them, 3 seconds per round. 20 rounds per minute. Klaus's hands slowed for just a moment as the mathematics crystallized in his mind. His Granatwerfer, manned by 2 men trained at Germany's finest artillery school, could fire 15 rounds per minute, maybe 20 if they pushed. These 3 American mortars, lighter, smaller caliber, supposedly inferior weapons, were firing 60 rounds per minute combined, 4 times his rate of fire. Ernst noticed the pause. "Klaus, keep firing!" Klaus snapped back, loading round 12. But the American shells were finding their range now. The first one impacted 50 meters to his left. The second hit the stone wall 30 meters behind. The third round came straight down into the position next to theirs. Crew. Gone. And the Americans weren't stopping. The shells kept coming. 1 every second from each mortar. 3 per second total. The sound was like a drum roll, a continuous percussion that made the ground shake. Klaus fired round 15. 16. 17. His barrel was heating up. He could see the air shimmering above the tube. German doctrine called for a barrel change every 75 rounds, every 5 minutes of maximum fire. But they only had 1 spare barrel, and it was back at the supply point 2 kilometers away. The Americans had no such concerns. Their lighter tubes, their smaller rounds, they could fire indefinitely. Klaus watched through gaps in the smoke as 1 American crew paused for maybe 10 seconds, then resumed firing. A barrel change, completed faster than Klaus could calculate a single range correction. Another American shell impacted. This one was close. Too close. Dirt and stones rained down on their position. Ernst ducked behind the wall. His face pale. How are they doing this? Klaus didn't answer. Because he knew. It wasn't skill. It wasn't training. It was design. The American Mortar had a fixed firing pin in the base of the tube. Drop the round in, it fires automatically. No manual trigger, no delay. The German Granatwerfer needed that careful 4-second cycle. Prepare round, load round. Ensure proper seating. Fire. The Americans just dropped shells down a tube and let physics do the rest. Simple. Crude. Fast. Klaus fired round 20. His hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the vibration, from the continuous firing. But the Americans were still firing. Faster, more, always more. The morning sun climbed higher. Klaus had lost count of the American rounds landing around his position. 40? 60? The dust was so thick he could barely see the valley below anymore, but he could hear them. Every 3 seconds. Shell after shell after shell. Lieutenant Werner's voice returned on the field telephone. All positions. Conserve ammunition. Fire only when you have clear targets. Klaus wanted to laugh. Clear targets? Through this curtain of American mortar fire? He couldn't even see his own hands clearly. But the order was the order. He stopped firing. Ernst stared at him. "What are we doing?" Klaus pointed at the ammunition pile. 23 rounds left. At 15 rounds per minute, 90 seconds of firing time. The Americans probably had hundreds of rounds, maybe thousands. The sound of American mortar fire continued. Rhythmic, relentless, mechanical. Klaus counted 37 impacts in 1 minute, from 3 mortars. The mathematics were brutal. His single Granatwerfer, with 2 trained crewmen, could fire 15 rounds per minute. 3 American mortars, probably crewed by men with a few months' training, were firing 37, more than double his rate. And he knew what he wasn't seeing. Somewhere behind those ridges, there were probably more American mortar teams, supply trucks carrying thousands of rounds, ammunition dumps that never ran empty. Klaus thought of Obergefreiter Dietrich, who'd crewed mortars in France. He'd said, just endless trucks, endless ammunition, endless everything. Klaus had nodded and thought Dietrich was exaggerating. But now, sitting in this stone observation post with 23 rounds left and American shells falling every 3 seconds, he understood. The Americans weren't better trained. Their weapons weren't more accurate. Their tactics weren't more sophisticated. They just had more mortars, more ammunition, more of everything, and they fired faster. Ernst broke the silence. Should we displace? Klaus checked his watch. 09:15 hours. They'd been in action for 43 minutes. In that time, he'd fired 20 rounds. The Americans had probably fired several hundred, maybe 1,000. Yes, Klaus said quietly. Start breaking down the weapon. They moved mechanically, the way they'd practiced. Bipod disconnected, 7 seconds. Baseplate freed, 4 seconds. Tube separated, 8 seconds. Total breakdown time, under 30 seconds for a 2-man crew. Klaus hefted the tube over his shoulder, 26 kilograms. Ernst grabbed the bipod and baseplate. They moved at a crouch, staying low behind the wall. The American shells continued to fall behind them. Klaus counted intervals as they moved. 3 seconds, 3 seconds, 3 seconds. Like a metronome, like a machine. 200 meters from their old position, Klaus paused and looked back. The stone walls where they'd set up were gone, obliterated by American fire. If they'd stayed another minute, they'd be dead. But what struck Klaus wasn't fear. It was a thought so clear, it felt like truth. This wasn't about skill anymore. This was about capacity. The Americans had built a war machine that didn't need to be better. It just needed to be more. Reached the secondary position at 09:38. Klaus set down the mortar tube and immediately began calculating their next fire mission. But his mind kept returning to that sound, the steady drumbeat of American mortar fire. Thump, thump, thump. Every 3 seconds, 20 rounds per minute per mortar, 60 rounds per minute from 3 mortars, 120 rounds in 2 minutes. More shells than his entire platoon could fire in an hour. The mathematics of defeat were becoming impossible to ignore. 1 week earlier, September 12th, 1944, Wünsdorf training ground 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Klaus had stood in formation with 200 other Granatwerfer crewmen, listening to Hauptmann Friedrich Becker deliver the weekly briefing on enemy capabilities. The American 60mm mortar is inferior to our Granatwerfer in every measurable category, Becker had said, his voice confident. Range, accuracy, killing power. Our crews are better, trained. Our doctrine is superior. Our weapon is the finest in the world. Klaus had believed it. Every man in that formation had believed it. And technically, it was true. The Granatwerfer 34 had a maximum range of 2,400 meters. The American M2 only reached 1,800. The Granatwerfer fired a 3.5 kilogram shell. The American round weighed only 1.3 kilograms. The German mortar was built by Rheinmetall Borsig, one of the finest arms manufacturers in Europe. Precision machined, quality controlled at every stage, every tube tested to exacting standards. The American mortar was built by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. A tire factory, Klaus had thought. They make boots and tires, and now they make mortars. Hauptmann Becker had shown them photographs of captured M2 mortars. The design is simplistic, he'd explained, crude even, but most telling is their rate of fire. Our intelligence estimates they can achieve 18 rounds per minute from a trained crew. We can match that easily. Klaus had raised his hand. Only 18 rounds per minute, Herr Hauptmann? Becker had smiled. Yes, Hartmann. Only 18. And that's from their best crews. Most will be lucky to manage 12. Our standard is 15, and we regularly exceed it. The men in the formation had straightened with pride. 15 rounds per minute from a weapon that outranged the enemy by 600 meters. That accuracy could place shells within a 10-meter circle at maximum range. That could be broken down and moved by 2 men in under 30 seconds. The finest medium mortar in the world, Becker had concluded. In the hands of the finest mortar crews in the world. The formation had dispersed with high morale. Klaus had walked to the training range with Ernst, both of them energized by the briefing. That afternoon, they'd practiced sustained fire drills. 15 rounds per minute for 10 minutes. 150 shells total. They'd maintained the pace perfectly, their movements synchronized like a machine. At the end, their instructor, Feldwebel Kraus, had nodded with satisfaction. Excellent work. This is the standard the Americans cannot match. Klaus had felt proud. He'd spent 6 months at Wünsdorf learning this weapon. Every component, every drill, every calculation. They'd practiced range estimation until Klaus could call a firing solution within seconds. They'd practiced breakdown and displacement until they could relocate a position in under 2 minutes. 6 months of intensive training to master a weapon that took 3 men to crew properly: gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. 3 men who had to work together with absolute precision to achieve those 15 rounds per minute. Industrial, impressive. They'd watched as raw steel became precision tubes, as each Granatwerfer was assembled by skilled craftsmen, as every weapon was test-fired 20 times before being approved for field use. The foreman had explained the numbers. 1 Granatwerfer 34 required 117 kilograms of raw materials, 810 Reichsmarks per unit. 42 hours of skilled labor. Quality had a cost, but it was worth it. Then Klaus had seen the intelligence report on American production. The document had been passed around during a tactics class. 60,000 M2 mortars produced during the war. 60,000. Klaus had done the math in his head. Germany had produced about 71,000 Granatwerfer systems. Similar numbers, but the timescales were different. Germany had been producing the Granatwerfer since 1934. 10 years of production. 60,000 American mortars in 4 years. And the report had mentioned something else. 3 manufacturing facilities. The Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, the Reed Machinery Company, the Kennedy Van Sohn Engineering Company. Klaus had recognized none of the names. Not arms manufacturers, just factories that had been converted, and they were producing 15,000 mortars per year, each. Feldwebel Kraus had seen him reading the report. Concerning numbers? Hartmann? Klaus had shaken his head. Just surprised, Herr Feldwebel. The Americans are making more mortars than we thought. Kraus had shrugged. Quantity is not quality. They can make 100,000 crude weapons. It won't matter if they can't use them effectively. And their crews are inferior to ours. Klaus had accepted that explanation. It made sense. The Americans were wealthy, so they built many weapons. But wealth couldn't buy skill. Wealth couldn't buy the training that turned a man into a master of his weapon. And yet, now, sitting in this secondary position with 23 rounds left and the sound of American shells falling every 3 seconds, Klaus wondered if he'd been asking the wrong question. Maybe it wasn't about skill. Maybe it wasn't about quality. Maybe the war had become something else entirely. Something that didn't care about precision, craftsmanship, or months of training. Something that only counted rounds fired, targets suppressed, enemy heads kept down. Ernst was watching him, waiting for orders. Klaus realized he'd been silent for over a minute. Set up the mortar, Klaus said finally. Facing south. Range, 800 meters. We'll wait for targets of opportunity. Ernst nodded and began assembling the weapon. Klaus pulled out his field manual, not because he needed to reference anything, but because he needed something familiar, something solid. He found the section on sustained fire doctrine. Maximum sustained rate, 12 to 15 rounds per minute. Barrel replacement required after 75 rounds or 5 minutes of continuous fire. Recommended crew, 3 men minimum for optimal efficiency. The doctrine was sound. The math was correct. 15 rounds per minute was excellent performance for a mortar this size. But Klaus couldn't stop hearing that sound. Thump, thump, thump. American mortars firing every 3 seconds, 20 rounds per minute. Not from a superhuman effort, not from crews pushing beyond their limits, just from the way the weapon was designed. A fixed firing pin. A drop-fire mechanism. Simple, crude, fast. Klaus closed the manual. The morning air was getting hot. In the valley below, the American infantry was regrouping. They'd taken casualties from Klaus's initial barrage, but they weren't retreating. They were bringing up more mortars. Klaus counted 6 tubes now, maybe 8. It was hard to tell through the dust. If each one could fire 20 rounds per minute, that was 160 rounds per minute total, nearly 3 rounds every second. Klaus thought about Hauptmann Becker's briefing. Our equipment is superior, our training is superior, our doctrine is superior. Victory follows superiority. But what if victory didn't follow superiority anymore? What if victory followed capacity? What if this whole war had become a question of mathematics, and Germany had been outmatched the moment the Americans started building tire factories that could produce mortars? The field telephone crackled. Klaus, this is Werner. How many rounds do you have left? 23 rounds, Herr Leutnant. Make them last. The resupply convoy was hit this morning. We won't get more ammunition until tomorrow, maybe later. Klaus didn't respond for a moment. Then, understood, Herr Leutnant. He set down the telephone and looked at Ernst. 23 rounds. At 15 rounds per minute, 90 seconds of firing time. In the valley, the American mortars were still firing. They'd been firing for an hour now. Hundreds of rounds. Maybe over 1,000. Road. Even from this distance he could see the wooden crates stacked in the truck beds. Ammunition. Thousands of rounds. Tens of thousands. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He'd heard stories from the Eastern Front. Soviet artillery that fired until the barrels melted. Wave after wave of attacks, each one supported by more shells than seemed possible. The Russians had numbers, endless numbers, but Klaus had always thought the West would be different. The Americans were supposed to be soft, rich, dependent on machines, but lacking the will to fight. That's what the propaganda said. But sitting here with 23 rounds and watching American mortar crews methodically dismantle his defensive line with volume of fire, Klaus realized propaganda was just another lie. The Americans weren't soft, they were just organized differently. They'd built a military that didn't need every soldier to be a master craftsman. They needed every soldier to be adequate, competent enough to use weapons that had been designed for mass production, simple enough that 6 weeks of training was sufficient, fast enough that quantity became quality, 3 seconds per round, 20 rounds per minute. 40 mortars could fire 800 rounds per minute. That was more than Klaus's entire battalion could fire in the same time. And the Americans probably had more than 40 mortars in this sector. They probably had hundreds. Ready, Klaus. Klaus nodded but didn't give a fire mission. Not yet. Not with 23 rounds. He needed to see something valuable, something worth the ammunition. In the distance, the American mortar fire slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. From every 3 seconds to every 5 seconds. Klaus watched through his binoculars as the crews took a break. They were drinking from canteens. Laughing. One crew was eating. Something from small tin cans. They weren't nervous. They weren't exhausted. They were taking a coffee break in the middle of a firefight. And why not? They had ammunition to spare. They had food to spare. They had time to spare. Klaus thought about his own rations. Half a loaf of bread this morning. Somerset's coffee that tasted like dirt. No meat in 3 days. The supply situation was, as Lieutenant Werner liked to say, challenging. Not because Germany couldn't produce food, but because the trucks that should have been bringing food were being bombed by American aircraft. The trains that should have been carrying supplies were being bombed by American aircraft. The roads that should have been open were being bombed by American aircraft. Everything was being bombed by American aircraft. Klaus had seen a report last week. American aircraft production, 1944. 96,000 aircraft. 96,000. In 1 year. He'd thought it was a typo. But the officer who'd shown him the report had confirmed it. Not a typo. 96,000 aircraft. Germany had produced about 35,000. The mathematics were insane, impossible, and yet, Klaus looked up at the sky every day and saw American bombers, formations of 50 planes, sometimes 100, sometimes more, all produced in factories that had been making cars 2 years ago. The same principle. Take a factory that makes civilian goods, convert it to military production, hire workers who don't need years of training, build simple, reliable weapons that can be mass-produced, build enough of them that quality becomes irrelevant. The kind of genius that didn't care about craftsmanship or pride or tradition, the kind of genius that only cared about numbers on a spreadsheet. Cost per unit times units produced equals combat power. No amount of German superiority could overcome American multiplication. The afternoon wore on. Klaus's crew displaced 4 more times. Each time, American mortar fire found them within minutes. Each time, they barely escaped. By 1600 hours, they were down to 8 rounds. Klaus had stopped firing at anything except direct threats, concentrated infantry, vehicles, command posts, targets that absolutely had to be engaged. Ernst was exhausted. His face was grey with dust and fatigue. How do they keep finding us? Klaus shook his head. He didn't know. Maybe the Americans had forward observers everywhere. Maybe they had radios that coordinated fire faster than German field telephones. Maybe they just fired so many shells that eventually they hit everything. At 1700 hours, the field telephone rang. All positions, begin withdrawal to final line. Move by bounds. Maintain contact. Klaus acknowledged. He looked at Ernst. Time to go. They broke down the mortar for what felt like the 100th time that day. Klaus's shoulders ached from carrying the 26-kilogram tube. Ernst was limping from a rock fragment that had hit his leg during one of the displacements. They started moving north. Behind them, American mortars continued to fire. The sound had become part of Klaus's consciousness. Background noise that never stopped. Thump, 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 every 3 seconds, all day, for hours. Klaus did more mathematics. 16 American mortars, 20 rounds per minute each, 12 hours of daylight. That was 230,000 rounds. 230,000. Even accounting for pauses, barrel changes, resupply delays, the Americans had probably fired 50,000 shells today. Klaus's entire battalion had maybe fired 500, 100 to 1. The ratio was staggering. They reached the fallback position at 1800 hours. Feldwebel Kraus was there, coordinating the withdrawal. He looked at Klaus's depleted ammunition. 8 rounds? Klaus nodded. We engaged multiple targets throughout the day. Kraus's expression was grim. The resupply convoy was destroyed. Again. We have no more ammunition coming tonight. Maybe tomorrow. 8 rounds. Klaus would have laughed if he wasn't so tired. 8 rounds to defend a sector against an enemy that fired thousands per hour. That's all anyone can ask. But privately, the Feldwebel added, between us, I don't know how much longer we can hold this line. Klaus appreciated the honesty. Days? Weeks? Kraus shrugged. Depends on ammunition, on reinforcements, on whether the Americans decide to push hard or take their time. His expression darkened. My guess? They'll take their time. Why rush? They can just shell us continuously until we run out of everything, then walk in and occupy the ruins. It was a depressing assessment. It was also accurate. That night, Klaus sat in a foxhole next to Ernst. Around them, other soldiers were preparing defensive positions, digging trenches, stringing wire, setting up machine guns. All the work of men preparing to defend ground they knew they couldn't hold. Ernst was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My brother wrote to me last month. He's in the Ruhr, working at a steel mill. He said they work 12-hour shifts now. The Americans bomb them during the day. They repair the damage at night, then work the next day. He said production is down 70%. Klaus listened. Ernst continued. He asked me how the war was going. What was I supposed to tell him? That we're doing fine? That we're winning? That his 12-hour shifts matter? Klaus didn't answer. What could he say? That Ernst's brother was wasting his time? That even if the Ruhr produced at full capacity, it wouldn't be enough? That America outproduced Germany by ratios that made victory impossible? I didn't know what to write back, Ernst admitted, so I didn't write anything. Maybe that was answer enough, Klaus said quietly. They sat in silence. In the distance, occasional American shells still fell, harassing fire, keeping German heads down, preventing sleep. The Americans didn't even need to launch a night attack. They could just fire shells randomly and achieve the same effect. Exhaustion, disruption, demoralization. Klaus thought about the Granatwerfer sitting disassembled next to him. 8 rounds left. 8 carefully crafted shells, each one precisely manufactured to exact specifications, each one expensive, each one representing hours of skilled labor at factories that were being bombed daily. He thought about the American Douar mortars in the valley. Probably hundreds of rounds per crew. Simple shells. Mass-produced. Cheap. But effective. More than effective. Overwhelming. The finest weapon in the world, Klaus thought again, can't defeat the adequate weapon produced in unlimited quantities. It was the lesson of this entire war, written in mathematics and delivered in high explosive. The night was cold. Couldn't. His mind kept running numbers, calculating ratios, comparing production figures. America produced 2 million tons of steel per month. Germany produced 500,000. America produced 8,000 aircraft per month. Germany produced 3,000. America produced 2,000 tanks per month. Germany produced 800. Every category, every comparison. The ratios were 2 to 1, 3 to 1, sometimes 4 to 1. How do you fight that? How do you overcome arithmetic? Klaus must have dozed off eventually because he woke to the sound of incoming fire. Dawn. The Americans were starting early. He grabbed his helmet and pressed himself against the foxhole wall. Ernst was already awake, counting the impacts, at least 20 shells in the last minute. Klaus checked his watch. 05:30 hours. The barrage continued for an hour. Not intense, not concentrated on any particular target, just steady harassment fire. At 06:45, the American infantry began their advance. Klaus watched through binoculars. 2 companies, maybe 250 men, moving in good order. Behind them, the mortars, still firing, still supporting. At 0700 hours, Lieutenant Werner gave the order. Hartmann, engage the advancing infantry. Klaus looked at his 8 remaining rounds, looked at the 250 Americans advancing with 16 mortars supporting them. The mathematics were obscene, but orders were orders. He loaded the first round, adjusted for range. 600 meters, wind from the east, temperature cool. He fired. The shell impacted among the American infantry. Men scattered. Klaus loaded the second round. Fired. Third round. Fired. The Americans took cover. They weren't advancing anymore. Klaus had stopped them. For now. but he'd used 3 shells, 5 remaining, and the American mortars had found him again. The first shell impacted 40 meters away, the second, 30 meters. Displace! Klaus and Ernst broke down the weapon. Again. They ran to a new position. Set up. Again. Klaus looked at his 5 remaining shells. 5 rounds. Against an army that could fire thousands per hour. The absurdity was complete. At 0730, American infantry resumed their advance. They'd taken casualties from Klaus's mortar fire, but they had replacements. More men. Always more men. Klaus fired his 4th shell. 5th, 6th. Each one found targets. Each one stopped the advance temporarily. But temporarily wasn't enough. Ernst handed him the 7th shell. Klaus hesitated. 2 rounds left after this. Once they were gone, his crew was finished. No more mortar support. No more indirect fire. Just 2 men with rifles against an army with unlimited ammunition. He fired the 7th shell. 1 round left. The American mortars found them again. Closer this time. 10 meters away. 5 meters. The ground erupted. Klaus felt something hot slash across his arm. Shrapnel. Not serious, but bleeding. Ernst was on the ground, dazed from the concussion. Get up! Klaus pulled him to his feet. They grabbed the weapon components and ran. Behind them, American shells turned their position into a crater. They dove into a drainage ditch. Klaus's arm was throbbing now. He looked at the wound. Maybe 3 centimeters long. Not deep. He'd live. Ernst was checking himself for injuries. I'm okay. Just got my bell rung. Klaus laughed. Couldn't help it. The situation was so absurd it was funny. 1 round left. 1 final shell in a day-long battle against an enemy with unlimited ammunition. Ernst started laughing too. The kind of laughter that wasn't quite sane. The laughter of men who'd done the mathematics and understood the joke. They sat in the ditch for several minutes, catching their breath. Rifle fire. The endless percussion of American mortars. Klaus looked at his last remaining shell. High explosive. 3.5 kilograms. Precisely. Manufactured at the Krupp works. Probably cost 20 Reichsmarks to produce. He could fire it at the advancing Americans. Might kill 3 or 4 men. Might wound a few more. And then it would be gone. And his value as a mortar crew would be 0. Or he could save it. Carry it back. Add it to whatever pitiful ammunition stockpile the battalion still had. 1 drop in an ocean of need. The mathematics didn't work either way. Ernst was watching him. What do we do? Klaus looked at the shell, looked at the American infantry advancing across the valley, looked at the 16 mortars still firing steadily, 3 seconds between rounds, never stopping, never running low. We withdraw, Klaus said finally. There's no point firing 1 shell against that. He gestured at the American forces. Ernst nodded. They weren't retreating. They weren't surrendering. They were making a rational decision based on arithmetic. 1 shell couldn't change the outcome. Might as well save it for a moment when it could make a difference. If such a moment ever came, they disassembled the mortar for the last time that day. Klaus hefted the tube over his shoulder, 26 kilograms of precision German engineering, the finest medium mortar in the world, currently useless because it had no ammunition. They started walking north, away from the American advance, away from the sound of mortars firing every 3 seconds. Behind them, the battle continued without them. The Americans didn't even notice their departure. Why would they? 2 men with an empty weapon weren't a threat. Klaus and Ernst walked for 3 hours, past defensive positions being hastily prepared and then abandoned, past supply trucks that had nothing to deliver, past artillery pieces with empty ammunition racks. The front was collapsing, not dramatically, not with panic, just steadily retreating because the arithmetic made forward defense impossible. They reached the battalion command, post at 1100 hours. Feldwebel Kraus was there, coordinating what remained of the defense. He looked at Klaus's empty ammunition bag. All gone? All gone, Klaus confirmed. Klaus nodded. You're not the only one. The entire sector is out of mortar ammunition. He gestured to a map on the table. The Americans are advancing on a 4-kilometer front. We can't stop them. We can barely slow them. Klaus looked at the map. The red lines representing German positions had been erased and redrawn. So many times the paper was starting to tear. Each redrawing was further north, further back. Klaus saw his expression. Don't blame yourself, Hartmann. You and Ernst did good work today. Probably stopped 2 American platoons. Maybe killed 20, 30 men. Klaus wanted to laugh again. 20 or 30 casualties. Against an army that had millions of soldiers. Against a nation that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. His day's work might have delayed the American advance by an hour, maybe 2. Klaus seemed to read his thoughts again. I know what you're thinking. That it doesn't matter. That 20 casualties is nothing against their numbers. He paused. You're right. But we still do our duty. We still fight, because that's what soldiers do. Klaus nodded. But privately, he wondered, was duty enough when the mathematics made victory impossible? Was it enough to do your best when your best couldn't overcome ratios of 10-1? We're withdrawing again tonight. Klaus and Ernst found the supply tent. The rations were sparse, some bread, weak coffee, no meat. The supply sergeant apologized. The convoy was hit again. This is all we have, Klaus ate mechanically. Couldn't taste anything. Couldn't think about anything except mathematics. Ernst was silent, staring at nothing. Finally, he spoke. Klaus, do you think we can win this war? Klaus looked at him. Really looked at him. Ernst was 22 years old, bright, capable. One of the best assistant gunners Klaus had worked with. He deserved an honest answer. No, Klaus said quietly. I don't think we can. Ernst nodded slowly. He didn't seem surprised. How long do we have? Klaus shrugged. Months. Maybe a year. Depends on how fast the Americans want to push. But the end is inevitable. They were silent for a while. Then Ernst asked, What happens to us? Klaus had thought about that. If we're lucky, we surrender before the end. If we're not lucky, we die fighting a war we know we can't win. It was brutally honest. But Ernst nodded. At least we know, he said. At least we're not pretending anymore. Klaus agreed. The pretending had been exhausting. Pretending that superior German quality mattered. Pretending that training and skill could overcome numbers. Pretending that doing your duty meant you were contributing to victory. Now, sitting in this supply tent with empty ammunition bags and the sound of American mortars in the distance, Klaus felt something like relief. The pretending was over. The mathematics were clear. Germany was losing. Not because German soldiers weren't brave. Not because German weapons weren't excellent. But because arithmetic didn't care about courage or quality. Arithmetic only cared about ratios. And the ratios were impossible. The Granatwerfer was turned in to the armory. 810 Reichsmarks of precision engineering, heading back to depot for reassignment. Klaus felt oddly sad. He'd crewed that weapon for 18 months, fired over 3,000 rounds. It had never failed him. Ernst shook his hand. Good luck with training. Tell them, Klaus said. Tell the new crews the truth. Ernst nodded. I will. Klaus boarded a truck heading north, away from the front, away from the sound of American mortars firing every 3 seconds. The truck bounced over rough roads, passing supply convoys heading south with half-empty trailers. Passing. Artillery pieces being towed to new positions further back, passing all the machinery of an army in slow retreat. Klaus looked back once. Couldn't see the battlefield anymore, but he could still hear it, faintly. The distant percussion of American firepower. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of arithmetic converted into high explosive. The sound of American industrial capacity, overwhelming German quality. The sound of inevitable defeat. Klaus arrived in Germany 4 days later. The training facility was in Bavaria, far from the fighting. Clean, organized, full of young recruits eager to learn. Klaus was assigned to teach mortar tactics. He stood before his first class of 30 recruits and looked at their faces, eager, confident, believing in German superiority. Klaus remembered feeling that way once, 18 months ago, before Monte Cassino, before he'd counted American mortars firing every 3 seconds, before he'd done the arithmetic. He began his lecture. The 8-centimeter Granatwerfer 34 is the finest medium mortar in the world. The recruits nodded. They believed it. Klaus continued. It has superior range, accuracy, and killing power compared to enemy weapons. The recruits smiled. They were proud to crew such a weapon. But, Klaus said, and the recruits leaned forward, the enemy has advantages we must understand. The Americans field mortars that are lighter, simpler, and faster to fire. They sacrifice range and accuracy for rate of fire. And they have more of them. Many more. The classroom was quiet. Klaus could see confusion on some faces. How many more? A recruit asked. Klaus did the calculation in his head. At least 3 to 1. Maybe 4 to 1. Maybe more. The recruit looked troubled. But if our weapons are superior, how does that matter? Klaus looked at him. Really looked at him. This recruit was maybe 19 years old. He deserved an honest answer. Because, Klaus said slowly, when the enemy can fire 4 shells for every one of ours, superior quality becomes irrelevant. They don't need to be better. They just need to be adequate. And adequate, multiplied by overwhelming numbers, becomes decisive. The classroom was very quiet now. Another recruit raised his hand. Are you saying we can't win? Klaus paused. He knew the correct answer. The patriotic answer. The answer that wouldn't get him reported to the political officers. He gave the honest answer instead. Every analysis, every comparison of production figures, suggests the outcome is determined by arithmetic. Our skill, our courage, our superior equipment, these things matter. But they can't overcome ratios of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. The classroom remained silent. Klaus could see the truth settling into these young minds. The same truth he'd learned over 18 months of combat. Quality couldn't defeat quantity, not at these ratios. Klaus continued teaching, day after day, week after week. Training young crews to use the finest medium mortar in the world. Teaching them the tactics, the calculations, the procedures, and always, telling them the truth about what they'd face. The American M2 mortar, lighter, faster, produced in overwhelming numbers, supplied with unlimited ammunition. Some recruits understood immediately, others took longer, but eventually they all reached the same conclusion Klaus had reached. They were being trained to crew excellent weapons in a war that would be decided by arithmetic, and the arithmetic wasn't in Germany's favour. 6 months later, Klaus received a letter from Ernst. His old assistant gunner was still in Italy, still fighting. The letter was short. Klaus, you were right about everything. The Americans just keep coming. More mortars, more ammunition, more everything. We're withdrawing every day now. Losing ground we fought for months to hold. I think about what you said. That we're losing an arithmetic problem. We're right. But we still fight. Because what else can we do? Stay safe. Tell the new crews the truth. Ernst. Klaus folded the letter carefully. That night, he stood outside the barracks and looked at the stars. Somewhere to the south, Ernst was probably sitting in a foxhole, listening to American mortars fire every 3 seconds. Somewhere further south, American factories were running 3 shifts, producing mortars and shells faster than Germany could destroy them. Somewhere across an ocean, in places Klaus had never seen, the arithmetic was being written. 2 million tons of steel per month, 8,000 aircraft per month, 2,000 tanks per month. Numbers that made German production look like a cottage industry. Klaus thought about the Granatwerfer, the finest medium mortar in the world, precision engineered, beautifully designed, deadly in skilled hands. It was all true. But it wasn't enough. Because the Americans had learned something Germany hadn't. That adequate weapons, produced in overwhelming quantities, were more decisive than superior weapons produced in limited numbers. That 3,000 crude factories running at full capacity could outproduce 1,000 excellent factories running at half capacity because they were being bombed. That mathematics, not quality, determined the outcome of modern industrial warfare. Klaus looked up at the stars and thought about the sound he'd heard every day for 18 months. Thump, thump, thump. American mortars firing every 3 seconds, 20 rounds per minute. 40 mortars, 800 rounds per minute. The sound of arithmetic made audible. The sound of German defeat written in high explosive and delivered at industrial scale. He'd tried to stop them with skill, with training, with the finest weapon in the world, but he'd been fighting mathematics, and mathematics didn't care about quality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen. Now, and don't forget to subscribe.